Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor, and I'll be one of your hosts today. And joining me, as always, is Tanner with a special announcement for bonus episodes.
Hey, everybody. We don't have any new patrons to thank this week, but in the interest of maybe getting some, did just want to mention something that we've been discussing and wanting to mention, but we keep forgetting. If you're not currently a patron and there's ever a bonus episode that we're posting about that strikes your interest and you want to check it out, just send us a message. We are happy to share a one-off bonus episode with you if it's something that you're interested in. Give us a shout if something catches your interest. That is all I've got there.
Nice. Well, with that, let's just roll into the media check-ins. For me, the big one for me is Gordon Lightfoot. As we all know, he passed away very recently. I know we'd posted about it when it happened, that quite literally this podcast probably wouldn't exist without him, kind of hooking me into shipwrecks with the song. But yeah, just kind of a sad thing. We were both very lucky that we got to see him. But just like a great performer, like I am kind of glad that he has a bigger legacy beyond just the Requiem of Fitzgerald, because he was such a talented like songwriter and performer.
I think the enduring legacy, though, of Gordon Lightfoot is, you know, when the news broke that he'd passed away, and just the massive range of ages and backgrounds of people posting about it and sharing songs, you know, whether it was Edmund Fitzgerald or something else. And I think that really says all you need to say about Gordon Lightfoot as a musician and as a storyteller, is the amount of different people he's able to influence with the songs that he created.
Yeah, for sure.
And those songs are there forever. I've been listening to my fair share of Gordon as well. I mean, more than normal, I guess. There's always a little bit in the rotation. I guess on top of that, I've been reading the book Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen Platt. And that's a book I was turned on to by Lions Led by Donkeys. They did a 4-part series that just recently wrapped up on the Taiping Rebellion in China.
Yeah, that was a good series.
Excellent series. And that was one of 2 books that Joe recommended there. And I've got about 70 or 80 pages left in this one. It's a great look into it. It's kind of as a podcaster who podcasts about history stuff. It's actually a good insight into how to draw an interesting episode or series out of a, you know, larger story. Because there's many parts of that book that probably wouldn't make for good podcasting.
Right.
They're dry and dense. They have their interesting moments, but there's parts of that book. It's not an enormous book, but there's parts of the book that are pretty dense, especially if you're not coming in with a huge existing knowledge of China.
Right.
For someone like me, I don't know that much about Chinese history, and certainly not Chinese history in the mid 1800s. So I've been really enjoying that book. It's really sort of rounded out some of my understanding of the Taiping Rebellion. And just the time period in general. It's an interesting time because you've got that, and parts of it are very parallel to the American Civil War. So kind of looking at the international stage, and you've got countries like Britain who have to deal with all of the upheaval that's being caused to their interests in China, and then also the same thing happening in the United States at the same time. So yeah, it's been really a fascinating read.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
I've been somewhat liberated of my Spanish Armada reading recently, since I've finished most of that. So I've been able to get into some new stuff.
Nice.
So on that note, we are going to wrap this up today, at least in the main feed, with episode 4 on the Spanish Armada. So if for some reason you find yourself starting with this episode, please go back and listen to the previous 3. We did all that work for a reason. Don't jump straight to the shipwrecks. Don't eat the dessert first.
It's really stolen valor at this point.
Everyone else fought all the way through to get to this point, through all the logistics and planning. So when we left off last week, the Armada was fleeing north after clashing with the English fleet in the narrow seas between Dover and Calais. That was really just the final engagement of a long, several days running sea battle that had begun off of Plymouth on the south coast of England. They were pursued by the English vessels as far north as the Firth of Forth, after which nothing was really known about their activities for quite some time. Like all these stories that we read about in history, the story seems very cut and dry when you know how it ends, you know what is happening from kind of your omniscient point of view. But when they sail north, the English don't know what their intentions are. They don't know if the Spanish even have a plan, what it may be. There's lots of options for them. So it really is just kind of a sit and wait and hope to be able to respond to whatever happens. The flight of the Armada northward wasn't even really a foregone conclusion. Had the winds shifted and allowed the Armada to turn back, that keeps the rendezvous on the table. It allows them maybe to engage in another attack on the English.
Right.
After all that heavy combat in the Channel, the English fleet is basically out of ammunition. If that fight continues, it might start to turn against the English. Had the Armada managed to turn around for another attack, they may have sailed basically unchallenged and cleared the seas for Parma's invasion force. But with all that, we do still have the issue of the Dutch fleet under Justin of Nassau that still maybe makes that a moot point.
Right.
So once they had passed the Firth of Forth, and the English had given up the chase, Thomas Fenner of the English fleet, he made the following prediction.
I verily believe they will pass about Scotland and Ireland to draw themselves home, wherein the season of the year considered, with the long course they have run, and their sundry distress, and of necessity the spending of time by watering, winter will so come on, as it will be their great ruin. Mine opinion is they are, by this time, so distressed, as many of them will never see Spain again.
To make another media connection with, Fenner's comment here, knowing what the Spanish are probably sailing into, it reminds me a bit of The Lord of the Rings in the Two Towers, when they're trying to track where Pippin and Merry have gone, and they realize they've run into Fangorn Forest, and they're like, oh, we really don't want to go in there.
Right.
That kind of thing is probably exactly what Thomas Fenner was feeling here when he made that comment. They're sailing up past Scotland. So let's look at Scotland. They've been kind of a side player, a very minor player so far in the story, and they'll continue to be, really. Catholic Europe was kind of divided in their opinion of whether or not Scotland was a reliable potential ally. They still had a significant Catholic population, especially in the Highlands, and a historical grudge against England that had been and would continue to be used, against them. The current king, James VI, was the son of the imprisoned and then later executed Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. However, the complication here is that James was also the probable successor to Elizabeth on the English throne. It wasn't official, it wasn't written down anywhere, but he was going to be the best option. And so he's not likely to put that in jeopardy by throwing in with a coalition of England's enemies. That is the future James I of England, by the way. So by the 18th of August, the Armada had made it far enough north to turn west around the Orkneys.
It was a pitiful rate of progress, barely 50 miles a day. Their ships' poor sailing qualities made even worse by leaks and holes, damaged masts, and missing sails, and the accumulations of weed and barnacles on their hulls after months at sea.
A running theme on our show is these things, sailing, especially out in the open sea, is difficult when you do everything right and you have all the right stuff. A lot of these ships were never built to operate here. A lot of them are built for the Mediterranean. They've taken all this damage. They're falling apart. So under the best of conditions, this would be a difficult place to sail.
Right.
So in planning the Armada's course back to Spain, Medina Sidonia had one last big decision to make in planning the route that would get the most ships back to Spain intact. So one officer who was aboard the San Salvador, this is Pedro Coco Calderon, he suggested a path that took the fleet really far out into the Atlantic, so avoiding any possibility of running aground in Ireland. Calderon is one of the very few in the Armada who'd actually had experience sailing up in this area. Some of them had experience on the south coast of England, the southern coast of Ireland. Very few had ever been up here. Also, as we get into this, we'll be talking about a lot of different ships, and there's a lot of ships have the same name. Not so much in this episode per se, but if you're reading about if you're looking through a list of ships, there's a bunch of San Juans, there's a bunch of San Pedros. They might just have a different location attached to them, but there's a lot of ships that have the same name. So as this decision's being made, our reliable contrarian, Diego Flores de Valdes, he proposed instead taking the most direct route to Spain, so one that would hug the coast of Ireland. His justification for this was the very real possibility of starvation that might come with the longer route.
I just feel like I'd have to listen to the guy that's done it before.
Yeah, that would probably be wise. And, you can also see why so many people end up taking what looks to be the better route because it's shorter, and it ends up not going super well for them.
It's like the Donner Party, except their route wasn't actually.
Sort of. I mean, the shortcut isn't always the best.
Or supposed shortcut in their case.
Sometimes the experts actually do know what they're talking about. Oh yeah, in that case, supposed shortcut, I guess. Hadn't the guy who told the Donner Party about that never actually, taken that route?
I think he had done it, via horse or something.
Or he had done it the opposite way. He hadn't done it going, east to west or something. Something like that.
And I don't think it was with a wagon train. It was, just horses.
I knew there was some caveat to his recommendation.
Yeah.
I've never done it, but it should work. Medina Sidonia would kind of weigh his options, and he would conclude that Calderon's option was the safest. Just given the poor state of the ships and crews, the fact that a lot of these vessels don't have anchors anymore, you barely have the people to man these things, so probably the fewer obstacles, the better. He added further warning to any who might venture too far to the east.
Take great heed lest you fall upon the island of Ireland, for fear of the harm that may happen to you upon that coast.
I like that quote because I don't know if it was intended this way, but it reads in hindsight as very much like a double entendre of the physical risk to your ship, and also I cannot vouch for your safety if you have to land on Ireland.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was getting from it.
Yeah. Medina Sidonia also dispatched the letter to Philip to give a final accounting of what had befallen his armada.
This armada was so completely crippled and scattered that my first duty to your majesty seemed to save it, even at the risk of which we are undertaking this voyage, which is long and in such high latitudes. Ammunition and the best of our vessels were lacking, and experience had shown how little we could depend upon the ships that remained, the Queen's fleet being so superior to ours in this sort of fighting. In consequence of the strength of their artillery and the fast sailing of their ships, we have over 3,000 sick without counting the wounded, who are numerous on the fleet.
In a very similar vein to the communication delays with Parma, the pinnace that was carrying that message would arrive in Spain basically at the same time as the first Armada vessels. There's not much of a warning ahead of time.
Right.
On August 21st, when the Armada was a few hundred miles northwest of Ireland, Medina Sidonia tried to kind of hold up and reunite his remaining ships for the turn home. Over the next 2 weeks, a further 17 ships disappeared.
That's crazy, just disappearing in the night. It kind of reminds me of when you hear the stories like the Essex and waking up every morning and making sure all the lifeboats were there. And sometimes they're not.
So Medina Sidonia, he began battling his way south, following his own directions and keeping well out into the deep waters of the Atlantic. Other vessels had a different experience. Here's Neil Hanson talking about this.
The Armada ships approaching the unforgiving coasts of Western Ireland had been rendered barely navigable by English gunfire, and their crews were so depleted and weakened by battlefield fatalities, casualties, starvation, and disease that they could barely work them. They had few or no anchors, having cut them loose in the panic-stricken flight from the fire ships. Their maps were inaccurate, placing the Irish coast well to the east of its actual position.
Some of the maps that they're using here, so not only are they sort of too far east, a lot of the coastline is kind of rendered as a lot of straight lines. And if you look at a map of Western Ireland, you don't see a lot of straight lines.
Right.
It's very craggy and rocky. cutting it close to this when you don't actually know what you're sailing into is going to be a risk.
Yeah, that seems like a recipe for a bad time.
So while some of the ships are pushed off course, some of them actually did seek the Irish coast intentionally in order to land and reprovision. In general, the ships that come close to Ireland don't fare well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple in particular that we'll look at more closely here. According to History Ireland, the current count is that 33 ships of the Armada met their end on the Irish coast. So a few of them here. One of them is the Trinidad Valancera. This was a very large Venetian vessel that had actually been impounded for service in the Armada. She was under the command of Don Alonso de Luzon. I think we mentioned Trinidad Valancera at one point in an earlier episode.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that we did.
But this is kind of what she's famous for, is the following stuff that happens to her. Because she was one of the bigger, heavier vessels, one of her roles was to carry the heavy siege equipment that would be needed once the invasion force had landed. So this is kind of one of those interesting logistical aspects. You know, the Armada's not supposed to accomplish this goal on their own. They're supposed to work in tandem with the Duke of Parma. And here's one example of how theoretically that was supposed to work. They were going to be bringing all these, heavy siege train equipment that they would need to break down some of the English fortifications.
Yeah, I think it's interesting anytime that you see the integrated logistics like that early on, you're talking hundreds of years ago.
So the Trinidad Valancera and her 42 guns had been in the thick of all the fighting, and she'd sustained damage beyond what her pumps were now able to deal with. 42 guns is a lot for these ships.
A big vessel.
It is, and that's I think she was about 1,000 or 1,100 tons, and 42 guns. That's like about twice as many as most of these ships are carrying. Very heavily armed. So while running for land, the Valancera struck a reef at Kinnigo Bay, leading Don Alonso to go ashore with a few other men in one of the ship's boats. Once ashore, they were, quote, roughly handled by the Irish and relieved of, quote, money, gold buttons, rapiers, and apparel to the value of 7,300 ducats.
I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but what is the Irish tone towards the random Spanish sailor?
Mm-hmm.
Friendly or neutral or...
Yeah, and actually the upcoming quote from Martin and Parker kind of tells us a little bit about that, but it is very much kind of hit or miss. There's a wide range of treatment that these shipwrecked Spaniards and allied people experience, kind of depending on who finds them. Also, a lot of these Irish people in this part at this time, they probably don't speak English. So even if you have Spaniards who are speaking English, they might not have a great way to communicate.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
You do have some Irish who are at least nominally allied to the English. They're kind of operating under the English umbrella. There's a huge range here. So yeah, this quote from Martin and Parker, they have this to say about the experience of the Valancera.
Such treatment was typical of the response of the indigenous Irish population to the Armada survivors. They were considered fair game for plunder, but were otherwise, with rare exceptions, left physically unharmed. On some occasions, as on this, they were given active assistance.
The assistance here came in the form of another boat to transfer men ashore from the Valancera once the Spanish boat was lost. So marching his men inland, Don Alonso ended up taking a defensive position around a ruined castle while negotiating with local authorities. So we have a bit of a standoff here between these entrenched Spaniards and the English and their allied Irish forces under Major John Kelly. Don Alonso eventually surrendered in the interest of preserving the lives of his men as prisoners of war. That promise would ultimately not be honored. You have some pretty vicious moments here in the Spanish Armada in Ireland. Those survivors who were of too low status to be ransomed were led to a field where they were executed en masse.
I guess the idea being they're just not worth anything to keep around.
Basically, and coming up here, we have a bit more detail about what was behind that decision, because we'll see even ransoms go out the window in some of these situations. Don Alonso himself was among those who would eventually be ransomed back to Spain. He was obviously not super jazzed about what had happened to his men that he had negotiated for. Trinidad Valancera's wreck site was discovered in 1971 by the City of Derry Sub-Aqua Club.
Nice.
So props to them. She was positively identified by the inscription on one of her bronze cannons. And actually, Colin Martin, the Martin of Martin and Parker that we've been quoting extensively, is a professor at, I think, St. Andrews University. And he was actually integral in kind of the leading of analyzing this wreck, of uncovering and documenting what was there. So it's cool that he has a lot of legitimately hands-on experience with the Armada. Mm-hmm. Quoting here from an article on the wreck site by Connie Keller in the Journal of Irish Archaeology.
The artifact assemblage from the wreck is diverse, representing many aspects of shipboard life. The large guns from the site, along with the smaller armaments such as muskets, arquebus, and associated shot, gunner's rules, ramrods, and powder flasks, sword guards, dagger hilts, and unusual objects like ceramic grenade, all hint at the function of the ship as a man of war. Although prior to its requisitioning by Philip II, it functioned as an armed merchantman.
So yeah, it's cool with this one and with the other wreck sites, just based on the records that, is known about who was on what ship, everyone's backstory, they're able to identify specific objects that, belong to X person. We know that this person was a member of the Order of Santiago. We know he was on this ship. We know that his wife's name was this. So we've identified this medallion as belonging to him. It's really cool, the amount of stuff they're able to do, especially for one that's this old.
Yeah, that is really cool. Anytime you can make it personal, I feel like that's really cool.
There's one, I forget which ship it's on, but I think it's Alonso de Leyva. And, they found a locket or a medallion or something with an inscription from his wife or his fiance or something. And it says, "No tengo más que darte," like I have nothing more to give you. And seeing those personal connections with these people who exist on paper, but, this was a real person with real relationships is fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
So on the topic of treatment, the story of Trinidad Valancera highlights this wide gulf in treatment based on who you were found by, as we just talked about. Mm-hmm. Martin and Parker illustrate the policy adopted by Sir William Fitzwilliam, Elizabeth's Lord Deputy in Ireland.
Fitzwilliam was not disposed to take chances in what he described as these dangerous and broken times. His urgent dispatch to the Privy Council on 22 September pointed out that he had in all Ireland fewer than 750 soldiers at his disposal, and no cavalry mounts for want of horseshoes. Any serious Spanish landings, he felt, could not be contained. The chilling instruction, therefore, went out to his officers in the western provinces to apprehend and execute all Spaniards found, of what quality soever. Torture may be used in prosecuting this inquiry.
Torture is something that, especially in the modern day, it's usually talked about with euphemisms, like enhanced interrogation. It's very odd and interesting to see it just written about in print, just saying, hey, you can use torture if you want to.
Yeah, that is kind of funny for him just to be straight up like, yeah, you can do it. It's fine.
Do you know the song Follow Me Up to Carlow?
No.
The Irish song. It deals with some of the Irish revolts against Elizabethan rule in Ireland. And Fitzwilliam is mentioned by name in that song.
Interesting.
There's a line where he says, "And now for Black Fitzwilliam's head, we'll send it over dripping red to Lisa and her ladies." So a particularly brutal example of this order being followed to the letter came from the Sheriff of Clare, who captured about 60 shipwrecked survivors from the Armada. After a brief imprisonment that probably featured a good bit of torture, all 60 of these were hanged. This included Don Felipe de Cordoba, and as the Don in his name would indicate, this is someone who would normally have been ransomed.
Yeah, I was going to say, he seems almost too important to do that with.
That, of course, seems harsh treatment for the miserable and bedraggled remnants of a once proud armada. The overwhelming majority of these who were really just trying to get home, we know in hindsight they had no intentions of having any cohesive invasion of Ireland. At the time, the English in Ireland don't really have a great idea of even who exactly these ships are or where they're coming from. They might have been from, the ships they'd heard about in the Channel. There's rumors of a second invasion fleet heading directly for Ireland. This kind of circles back to those invasion plans. Those rumors were still circulating. Is Spain sending another fleet? Do they have the ships for that?
Yeah, that is true. Like you said, like knowing the future, obviously they're not. But yeah, I imagine it's a pretty scary time if you're an Englishman.
Yeah, especially, like Fitzwilliam is saying, he's like, I've got 750 guys here.
Yeah.
So on September 29th, Sir Richard Bingham, governor of the county of Connacht, wrote the following.
Further news of strange ships, whether they be of the dispersed fleet, which are fled from the supposed overthrow in the narrow seas, or new forces come directly from Spain. No man is able to advertise otherwise than by guess, which doth rather show their incoming from Spain, both by these falling from the west, and others which coasted along the north pass of Sligo. I expect very present news either from one place or the other, for by all likelihoods they mind to land.
Here, he mentions these ships falling from the west, and he mentions them on the north parts of Sligo. A lot of these ships that have come south along the Irish coast, some of them tried to double back north.
Really?
Because they're really questioning their ability to make it all the way across the Bay of Biscay, thinking, well, we could at least ground in Scotland. That would be marginally safer for us. Mm-hmm. So if you're, say, an English garrison on the coast of Ireland, you see these ships sailing north, you're probably assuming they're coming from Spain. So this might be a new invasion force.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you wouldn't assume that it was the same one.
Richard Bingham, who that quote was from, cool nickname, regardless of probably how he got it. He's dubbed the Flail of Connacht. You probably don't get that name by being a nice guy.
I wouldn't think so.
He would claim to dispatch nearly 1,100 Armada survivors unfortunate enough to come ashore on his territory. There's some level of willingness if you're killing 1,100 people.
Right.
But it's also noted that there was probably a little bit of begrudgingness here because that's a massive amount of ransoms he's losing out on too.
Yeah.
Probably not the worst day he's ever had, but he's probably still thinking about that money. Fun fact about Richard Bingham, we can count one of his descendants among our listeners. So shout out to Peter. I used to work with Peter at Half Price Books.
Nice.
Also, Peter has a really cool sci-fi series called The Fifth Civilization. It's a trilogy, so if you're listening, you should check it out. It's good enough to compensate for the sins of Richard Bingham for the slaughter of 1,100 Spaniards on the beaches of Ireland. Totally cancels that out. So another ship we'll talk about here is the Girona. I'm going to call it the Girona with the Catalan pronunciation, since that's what it's named after.
What would the other pronunciation be?
Girona. I'm assuming most of the Spaniards probably called it. The Girona was one of the 4 galleasses. She wrecked on the coast of Antrim. She was carrying not only her original complement of soldiers and sailors, but also the remnants of a few other ships who'd survived other sinkings.
Do you think there was a guy that survived 4 or 5?
Yes, and we will actually tell his story in a separate bonus episode. There's a very famous narrative about just this occasion.
It sort of got the same energy as that guy that was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, or like a Violet Jessup type.
Yeah.
So one of these people who had taken refuge on the Girona was Don Alonso de Leyva. He was one of the senior commanders in the Armada.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually, this is kind of a weird detail, he was kind of like, you know how in The Office Dwight has the secret number 2 assistant?
Yeah.
That's basically what Don Alonso de Leyva was, except this was a secret kind of to Medina Sidonia and everyone else also.
Really?
He had a secret letter from Philip that said, if anything were to happen to Medina Sidonia, you are in charge of the Armada. Despite the fact that Juan Martinez de Recalde was the official number 2, had something happened to Medina Sidonia, de Leyva would have whipped out this letter and said, hey, congratulations, I'm the new boss. But anyway, De Leyva had originally commanded the Rata Santa Maria in Coronada. It's usually just called the Rata in Coronada, the Crowned Rat, named apparently from its previous captain, Giovanni Maria Ratti. Fun backstory for this ship. Not a fun next part of the story, though. The vessel's known for its higher proportion of young nobles that it has on board. Don Alonso has this reputation that attracts all these young nobles because they know that he's going to be in the fighting. He's probably going to have a lot of success. I want to be close to this guy when the battle starts because that's going to rub off on me a little bit. The Rata and Coronada had grounded at Tullahan Bay, where she was abandoned and torched by the remaining crew. So after holding up at a nearby castle, another one, there's just castles.
I was going to say, are there just like random
everywhere?
castles?
every ship that wrecks, they just like hop into a nearby castle. Taking shelter in this nearby castle, they get word that another Spanish vessel had come ashore nearby. This was the Duquesa Santa Ana. So marching his men the 25 miles overland.
Not like that nearby.
Right. This is not a quick visit here. They joined with their comrades and they crammed onto the Santa Ana. This is like the Armada triathlon here. You survive this shipwreck, then you've got to march 25 miles. The Santa Ana herself would wreck at Lochrosmore Bay in Donegal, after yet again disembarking and yet again finding a small castle to shelter in. They spent about a week before hearing of another Armada vessel in the area. This would be the Galeasse Girona. De Leyva had been injured during this last escape, and a special chair was actually rigged up for him to be carried to the Girona. Girona was able to set sail on the 26th with about 1,300 on board.
That seems like so many people.
That's a lot for a ship, even one that's in good shape in this armada. So rather than sailing this hastily repaired and overloaded vessel back into the open sea, they make the decision to turn back for Scotland. However, off the coast of Antrim, Girona lost her rudder and was tossed onto the rocks at Lacada Point. This time, De Leyva finally appears to have used up all of his lives. He was lost along with most of those on board. The Girona's wreck site was uncovered in 1967. So way too many Armada wrecks in Ireland for us to cover here. It is fertile ground to revisit at some point down the line if we want to come back to it. But actually, not all the ships lost on the way home came ashore in Ireland. One recorded vessel, the hospital ship San Pedro Mayor, ran aground in England on the south coast of Devon. So it just made a big circle back to the south coast of England. And actually, due to its use as a hospital ship, there's men on the San Pedro when it wrecks that had been aboard the San Salvador, that vessel that blew up way back in the beginning of episode 2.
Wow, so they had this like circled back around to the start. Yeah.
There's guys who spent this whole time basically probably wounded in bed, and now they're back where they started. There's another vessel, the Grand Griffon, that washes up, or that wrecks on Fair Isle, which is like pretty isolated. It's all the way out. It's between the Orkneys and the Shetlands. So it's like northeast of Scotland. It's like between Scotland and Norway, kind of.
Yeah, that is out there.
We'll talk about them on the bonus episode, because there's a lot to that story that I don't want to just cram in here. But yeah, the bulk of these wash up in Ireland, but there are other places that they end up. So you asked about, people who survived multiple shipwrecks. One of them is a captain named Don Francisco Cuellar. He has one of the more fascinating first-hand accounts of the Armada. He was captain of the 24-gun San Pedro from the Castilian Squadron. Not going to go into detail here because I want to present his full narrative as an additional bonus episode. He really does have one of those stories that is unbelievable. It's a first-hand narrative, so some of it probably is embellished, but it's a pretty insane story. So let's talk about some of the final accounting for the Armada. Of the original 130 total ships that left Lisbon in May 1588, 90 made it back home. However, Hanson estimates that over half of these surviving ships were damaged beyond repair.
Yeah, that's not great. Like, just straight up just losing 40 ships, and then half of what did return is junk.
Yeah, plus the human cost of all this, which is estimated at around 20,000 dead.
That's crazy.
Especially when compared to the estimated 100 English killed in the Armada campaign. Not a bad exchange if you're England.
No, I would say that they were the winner of this one.
There's a lot of variance in the estimates for the number of ships. There's also variance in the estimates of how many ships are in the Armada, depending on what you consider to be a ship. Some of the estimates are only looking at the fighting ships, not really looking at the transports also.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of variance, but you're looking at roughly a third of the ships did not come home at all.
That's not great.
So despite Medina Sidonia's, self-acknowledged shortcomings as a naval commander, Garrett Mattingly actually leaves him with a pretty positive final assessment.
The wrecks in Ireland and around Scotland account for all of the fighting ships of the Armada lost, except to enemy action. At the Lizard on July 30th, there were 68. On September 3rd, Medina Sidonia could still count 44. These had obeyed his orders and followed the course he set. They all got home, including all 10 of the galleons of the Indian Guard, 7 of the 10 galleons of Portugal, 8 of the Andalusians, 7 of Oquendo's squadron, 6 of Recalde's. Only the Levanters were reduced to a skeleton, just 2 great ships left out of 10. It was a beaten, shattered fleet, but many a more experienced admiral has brought back fewer ships against less formidable odds. Whoever advised him, and at the crucial moment, it was neither Diego Flores nor Recalde, these ships were saved by leadership and willpower of their commander.
That positive assessment, obviously is taken kind of in comparison to other situations, other potential disasters, and saying this was bad and a tragic loss of thousands of people, but it could have been a lot worse.
I mean, it's sort of like a Dunkirk energy attached to that almost, I guess.
Making the best of a bad situation with someone who would be the first person to say, I am not qualified for this job.
Right.
So Medina Sidonia, he quickly sets about getting food, water, medical assistance for his remaining men.
The troubles and miseries we have suffered have been greater than have ever been seen in any voyage before, and on board some of the ships, there was not a single drop of water for a fortnight.
So I wanted to end this series with some viewpoint character wrap-ups, just from some of the people that we've kind of seen on stage throughout this, some people that we've kind of gotten attached to a little bit, I'd like to think.
Sure.
Juan Martinez de Recalde. Recalde served as second in command for the Enterprise of England, and he was also the oldest of the senior officers in the Spanish fleet. He had taken ill just after the fight at Gravelines, and he rarely rose from his bed during that journey home. One exception to this, actually, was when the San Juan was near the southwest tip of Ireland, and his knowledge of the coastline actually came super in handy. He successfully helped 2 other ships also navigate this area. These were the San Juan Bautista and the hospital ship San Pedro el Mayor, that one that ran aground ultimately in England.
Right.
So really, by him having the ability to get out of bed, he saved probably hundreds of lives just by doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really replace the experience, of being familiar with that area.
Recalde finally arrived back in Spain on October 19th. This is kind of it seems like a disputed date. Martin and Parker have him arriving in port on the 14th. Mattingly says the 7th. There's a lot of confusion of when he gets into port, when he leaves the ship, all of those, because he's basically carried off the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, the Armada would be the final chapter in his long career. He never recovered from that illness, and he died on the 23rd at the age of 62. So, pretty old for the time, we'd say.
Yeah, I feel like you've had a solid run, especially in a somewhat dangerous profession.
So, let's talk about Don Pedro de Valdes. Don Pedro, he was the Valdes cousin who was abandoned way back in episode 2 with the Nuestra Senora del Rosario. He lived as a prisoner in England for a time, although a prisoner who's very well taken care of in accordance with his status.
Yeah, I like how, at this point in time, if you're like a noble who's taken prisoner, you pretty much just on vacation.
Unless you've done something to personally offend someone in power, it's not a bad gig. He was held at Esher Place, which is a country house in Surrey. Again, not a terrible place to be held prisoner.
Right. Yeah, I could make it work.
You can still see pictures of this. It definitely is not a prison. This was owned at the time by Drake's cousin, Richard. He spent a lot of his time just kind of hanging out. He was present at parties, kind of as a curiosity, a little bit, hey, everybody come look at the Spanish prisoner. Also, during that time, he apparently helped to compile the first English to Spanish dictionary.
Interesting.
Cool contribution, I guess.
Yeah.
He returned home in 1593. He would actually go on to serve as governor of Cuba from 1602 to 1607. And he died on the 9th of March, 1615, in the comfort of his hometown of Gijón in Spain.
Nice. Sounds like it worked out, all things considered, pretty well.
It did. It sometimes works out to be abandoned by your cousin to the end of it.
Yeah, I feel like he might actually have one of the better stories of anyone.
Really did. I think he is the position that you'd envy of anyone from the Armada. However, on the other hand, the other side of this coin, maybe we could call this karma. I don't know. His cousin Diego Flores de Valdes, he comes out as probably the biggest loser among the surviving Spanish commanders.
He had urged the abandonment of Pedro de Valdes and of other ships unable to maintain the Armada's pace. He had issued orders to cut cables off Calais that had certainly cost the fleet several other ships, and he had been the first to argue for an immediate return to Spain following the Battle of Gravelines. It was known in Spain that Diego Flores de Valdes persuaded the Duke to break the king's instructions, whereupon the king gave instructions to all ports where the said Diego de Valdes might arrive to apprehend him.
So there's this blanket order of, hey, when this guy gets back, arrest this motherfucker.
That has like some really funny like implications that like he gets back into port and like sees pictures up of him.
Exactly. Like, oh. Have you seen this Don? Yeah, so that's interesting there in that, you know, if you listened to, I hope you've listened to it at this point, when we talked about the Battle of Gravelines, how Medina Sidonia issues those orders beforehand saying, slip your cables and buoy them so that we can maybe come back and get them. And then instantly cuts to most of these people cutting their cables entirely. That's why they don't have anchors. And so you wonder who gave that order. And at least the consensus that's come to after the fact is Diego Flores de Valdes gave that order.
Yeah, it seems like he wanted to be in charge really bad.
Yeah, and his consistent, I mean, that's one of the things that's listed as a morale killer is the fact that you've got this one guy, the second a ship falls behind, he's saying, no, keep going, let's leave them. So that obviously is not a great way to operate if you are one of those ships.
Yeah, some real Captain Sobel energy from Band of Brothers.
So the extremely unpopular Valdes, he really had no one to speak in favor of him. You know, this is kind of a situation where there's no video, there's no audio, there's no voice recorders on any of this. It's kind of whatever consensus you can get people to agree to is what happened functionally. So if you haven't made or kept a lot of friends along the way, you might end up like Diego Flores de Valdes. He ended up spending, one source said 3 years in prison. He was the only one from among the officer class to face punishment for the debacle of the Armada. A source here, I think this was from the Royal History Academy of Spain. A su regreso a España, tras la derrota, Diego Flores de Valdes fue procesado y encarcelado en la prisión de Burgos, donde murió poco después, siendo uno de los hombres más odiados y despreciados de la Armada Española. Basically, on his return to Spain after the defeat, Diego Flores de Valdes was arrested and jailed in the prison at Burgos, where he died shortly after, being one of the most hated and despised of the Spanish Armada.
So it doesn't sound like he went to a nice prison.
No, he probably didn't have the same imprisonment experience as his cousin. I was a bit confused because one of them said he was in prison for 3 years. One said that he died shortly after. Maybe that's what they mean by 3 years.
I guess 3 years could be shortly on a long enough timeline.
From what I could tell, he was not a free man after the Armada.
Right.
Parma would serve as commander of the Army of Flanders until his own death in 1592. He dies. You know, Philip II is getting kind of displeased with him. He's losing ground in the Netherlands. There's, you know, rumors at least that he's going to be relieved of command, and that usually doesn't bode well for someone's lifespan around this time. Something
Right.
similar had happened with Don Juan.
Mm-hmm.
He actually dies on his way back to Spain to visit with Philip. He kind of goes out with a whimper a little bit for someone who is this big name, this famed military commander. And yeah, he's only really got a few more years after this.
Right.
Medina Sidonia, he was pretty greatly affected by his experience physically and mentally, but he'd actually outlive a lot of the other key figures in the story. He actually served Philip through the end of his reign and into that of his son, Philip III. He died at home in Sanlúcar on July 26th, 1615, at the age of 64.
It sounds like all things considered, it worked out better than you might have thought for him.
Yeah. Yeah, really not a terrible end there. He maintains his position. He still commands troops. He actually has to defend Cadiz again from another English raid. Speaking of raids on Cadiz, Drake continued more or less doing the same stuff for the rest of his career until his death in 1596. His final voyage is probably actually something we could cover at some point. It's a bit of a debacle.
Yeah, I think we could do that.
Lord Howard, he continued to enjoy his favored position in courts with Elizabeth. He got more experience defending the realm. He was actually leading that 1596 raid on Cadiz. There was another Spanish Armada in 1597, which fell apart due to some storms. They did actually manage to land a few hundred troops in England. So you could argue that much less famous Armada was more successful.
Yeah.
Howard also suppressed the Earl of Essex's rebellion. This was kind of a big deal late in Elizabeth's reign. He lived into his late 80s, finally passing away in December 1624.
Yeah, I'd have to say that's really good for the time.
Hawkins, so Drake's cousin John Hawkins, he also continued on his life as a privateer / pirate / slave trader, I'm assuming. He would die at sea in 1595 while on an expedition to rescue his son from Spanish captivity.
Little known fact, his son Jim Hawkins would later go on to do the Muppet Treasure Island movie.
Correct, yes. There's got to be something better for him. For me!
I do hate that part. I do hate that song. It's the only song I don't like in that movie.
That was a taste of the Muppet Treasure Island bonus episode for you. Frobisher. So Martin Frobisher, he didn't have too much time left either. But he went out, maybe the way he would have wanted.
He died doing what he loved.
Fighting the Spanish and dying of an infected musket ball wound. He was killed during the relief of the Spanish siege of the French port of Brest in 1594. The surgeon was able to remove the musket ball, but surgery being what it was in the 1590s, the wound got infected and he died. It took him a couple weeks to die. He ended up, I think, dying back in Plymouth.
It's so funny that nowadays we don't even remove the bullet most of the time. Like, the bullet isn't the dangerous thing at that point. It's literally like infection and stopping the bleeding.
I think in that case, it was a case of like the swabbing or like the bandage. Some of that getting into the wound and becoming infected.
Yeah.
Not quite Death of James Garfield level, but that kind of stuff.
Things that happen in like this time period with medicine.
There's no enemas involved that I know of with Martin Frobisher's death.
There probably was.
Probably leeches. Justin of Nassau, he played a small but significant role in our story. He was a son of William the Silent. He'd go on to be active in the military and government of the rebellious Dutch provinces. I think to the extent that you could call Justin of Nassau famous to the general public, at least outside of the Netherlands, he's not. Mm-hmm. But to the extent that he is, he's in a painting that you've probably seen before in a very central role. And that's Diego Velázquez's The Surrender of Breda. So this is a painting that depicts the surrender of the Dutch city of Breda in 1625. So in the painting, the Spanish general Ambrosio Spinola, he's accepting the key to Breda from the city's commander, Justin of Nassau.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen this picture.
They're both kind of like bowing to. It's a very cordial looking painting. It's very divided, like right down the middle. You have it divided into Spain and the Netherlands.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that Robert E. Lee surrender picture.
yeah, you could say it's a similar type of style there. So yeah, that's a very famous painting. That's probably where you've seen Justin of Nassau.
Interesting.
Maybe you just didn't know it before. He died in 1631 in his early 70s. So he didn't quite see the Dutch revolt out to its completion, but he contributed a lot to its success.
I think it's interesting that a lot of these guys live for reasonably long periods of time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's there's that, that whole thing about how, life expectancy is skewed because of all the infant mortality. And this is kind of a good example of it. Even these guys who are living these pretty tough lives, they're consistently living into their 50s and 60s, some of them into their 80s. So it's like once you reached a certain point, there was a fair chance of you surviving relatively long.
Right.
Especially if you're in a position where you have influence and access to.
Yeah, like whatever the best medical care might be, even if it is 50,
even if it is leeches.
Yeah.
All right, so getting here to our biggest players here. Philip II. We might be curious about the pious Philip II's reaction to the failure of his Holy Crusade.
I sent my ships to fight against men, not the winds and tides of God.
So again, kind of like we said with the storm off of Corunna, if you find yourself fighting the winds and tides of God, like maybe that's time to reassess if what you're doing is actually what God wants. But no, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Philip ruled Spain and his other possessions for about another decade, until his death in September 1598 at the age of 71.
Pretty good.
He was succeeded by Philip III. That was a son with his fourth wife / niece, Anna of Austria.
What a wonderful combination.
It gets worse here. This is kind of this leads to literally like the stereotype of the Habsburgs.
So there's like proto Habsburg jaw like going on here.
Oh, not proto. It's coming here very soon. Philip III would marry his own cousin, Margaret of Austria. They would have another son, Philip IV. Philip IV's marriage to his niece, Maria Anna of Austria, would lead to the birth of Charles II, nicknamed in Spanish El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. He is the one who is tragically remembered as the go-to example of Habsburg inbreeding. I know we've talked about him before on the podcast, but that's a picture that people are usually familiar with. Charles II is a fascinating individual because his whole life, all of Europe is waiting for him to die. They know he's going to at some point, and they know he's not going to leave an heir. He actually lives a shockingly long time. He's basically unable to, at least early in life, he's unable to feed himself. He needs assistance to do pretty much everything throughout the day. So there's a lot of mental and physical challenges for him to be the leader of a globe-spanning empire. Mm-hmm. The empire that Philip II ruled would remain on the surface pretty much unchanged through all that time, despite the weakening of the rule and the need for reform that doesn't really happen. They end up holding on to a lot of their territory through all of that internal decay. And they really lose a lot of respect as a military power, in the 1600s. By the end of the 30 Years' War, Spain has sort of been knocked off of the top rung on the continent. The historian Fernand Braudel summed up Philip II of Spain as, quote, the sum of all the weaknesses and all the strengths of his empire. So Philip, as we've talked about, he could be distant, cold, and cruel. There's really no need for us to try and paint him as a good guy.
Right.
But in the aftermath of the Armada campaign, we see at least a glimpse of, his admirable qualities. People are complicated. Philip was enraged when he heard that sailors and soldiers of his Armada were being discharged without receiving the pay that they were owed. He wrote that this was
contrary to Christian charity, and also very much alien to my will. Those who have served and are serving me should not only be paid what they are owed, but rewarded as far as our resources permit.
I like the structure of that quote because he says contrary to Christian charity and also to my will. I feel like putting it second makes it seem like that's the more egregious transgression here is you made me angry. Philip ensured that survivors were housed, clothed, and fed, that the sick and wounded received medical care, provided pensions for seriously injured soldiers, for the families of those who were lost. They even sent out 2 ships of supplies out looking for ships that might still be struggling back home.
Interesting.
He does quite a lot to take care of the people that he sent on this mission.
Yeah, it seems like there's more there than you might expect at this time period.
And you could say, sure, that's like the least he could do for this, but there's plenty of people, Elizabeth included, that do nothing of the sort.
Right.
And you see in modern times, what happens when, soldiers are, in combat, they come home and they don't receive the treatment and the support that they're owed for the things that they did. The rectitude of those things aside, the country that sends you to do these things should probably take care of you after you come back.
Right.
So Elizabeth, she would continue to rule England until 1603, when she died at age 69, to be succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England.
I will say I think this is like the most interesting part of like English history. Like when I took an English history class in college, and a lot of it was really boring. I think the whole Elizabeth, James, Mary, like that whole time period.
If you haven't listened to the Stuart England podcast, you've got to listen to it. Oh, it's so good.
I think I maybe have listened to a couple of those.
So James's son, Charles, he'd become king in 1625. The end of his reign would be marred by the English Civil War, after which he would find himself beheaded on the orders of Parliament. After the interregnum, the monarchy would be restored under his son as Charles II. Here's where it gets interesting from a religious standpoint. So Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic. The children, they'd been raised in very close proximity to Catholicism while maintaining, at least on the surface, a devotion to the Anglican Church.
Mm-hmm.
But, you grow up, your mother and all of her people are Catholic, you're going to get a lot of exposure to it. Charles II, he underwent a deathbed conversion to Catholicism when he died in 1685. And his brother James, so James II, he was an open Catholic when he became king. That led to a lot of panic in England. James's very brief reign, so 1685 to 1688, was ended in the Glorious Revolution with the accession of the Protestant William III to the throne. So looking at this kind of in the long span of history, Philip's goal of restoring England to the true church would come to pass, briefly, but not through any sort of military means.
Right.
This wasn't done through an invasion and installing the Catholic Church back in England. This was just done more or less organically, and it was kind of rejected by the body of England.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, like the Protestant Catholic divide, and I'm sure we'll probably get into this in our next episode, but you would have to think that Ireland's trajectory would have been different had Spain been successful. And there's and England becomes like a predominantly Catholic country. You just have to think that the history of Ireland is shaped a little different at that point.
Yeah, it's possible. It's an interesting counterfactual because it's like the English obviously didn't need the religious divide to screw over the Irish. That was happening for centuries before that was even a thing, that split. But yeah, you have to wonder how that looks in history. That is a great discussion for our bonus episode. Some final conclusions here. So the significance of the Armada has been played up and played down at various times in history. In the immediate aftermath, though, it wasn't really recognized as this big smashing victory that it's kind of seen as today. Mainly because there's no decisive battle. This is a long running skirmish basically through the Channel, and for quite some time the threat remains a real thing because it hasn't been totally dealt with. Elizabeth is actually super unhappy with the performance of her fleet because they haven't captured any ships.
Right.
If this was a success, where are the ships that you're supposed to capture? This was in some ways seen as, if not a failure, definitely a missed opportunity.
Just because of the Spanish Armada even existing at that point?
Yeah, I mean, because looking at the numbers, it's like they've still got most of their ships sailing off. They're still in close proximity. There's still a lot of, nervy days here in the aftermath. The legend that we talked about of the small, swift English ships darting in and out of the hulking Spanish galleons, wreaking havoc, that was a very romanticized construction that helped to build the reputation of the English as a superior seafaring nation.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that was, in actuality coming to pass. They were becoming a dominant sea power.
Right.
And stories like that kind of helped to promote that.
It gives you like a very clean like fiction to like kind of tell everyone.
It's interesting in how historically it's been portrayed as both this massive underdog victory
Mm-hmm.
and also a mismanaged shambolic failure on the Spanish side. So like both of those things don't really make sense to be true at the same time.
Yeah, it's like when Travis Kelce was yelling after the Super Bowl. Everyone doubted us.
Everyone doubted
us like over and over. And even Patrick Mahomes was like, hey, dude, you need to chill slightly.
Yeah, if you look at the Spanish plans for this, no one thinks this is going to be easy. They know that the English fleet is a formidable force that could easily end this before they even set foot in England. This is a more equal matchup than it's sometimes portrayed as. And, England comes out on top, thanks in some parts to luck, but they're better prepared. They have the technology, they have the training, and they basically do the job that's expected of them. Recent scholarship is a lot more measured in viewing Philip's undertaking, both in its motivation and its execution.
Philip's pressuring of Santa Cruz during the fall and winter of 1587 and his continued exhortations to Parma and Medina Sidonia in 1588 were not the result of the king's losing contact with reality, but rather his coming to grips with it.
So yeah, it's easy to paint Philip as this religious fanatic who's shut up in his office and doesn't know what's going on. And in some cases that's true. But at the same time, he does seem to be aware of the fact that the more time we give the English, the more time we give them to build up their fleet, to, raid our ports, it's only going to go worse for us. So the faster we get this done, the better.
Right.
So as hasty and reckless as his preparations might seem, there's some level of logic to it. J.D. Mackey, writing in Scotland and the Spanish Armada, sums up the endeavor as follows.
The product of a strange medley of actions and motives, of courage and distrust, of piety and knavery, of the lowest lies and the highest of ideals, the Armada failed in its purpose. Yet even in this downfall, Philip commands our admiration, even as his poor storm-stricken soldiers attract our pity.
Would you say that you admire Philip after this?
Dream big, right?
Yeah. For me, I think that's a bit of a stretch. I don't think we have to admire Philip necessarily.
He's just learning that all of his losses are lessons, and he just needs to keep grinding.
No obstacles, just opportunities.
Exactly.
I think you and I wouldn't go so far as to say we admire Philip, but a realistic assessment of the people involved in the story, it always makes the story much more full and much more interesting, and it's easier to take lessons from a story where people are presented as realistically as possible. And I think that's something to look at here is, there's multiple reasons why the Spanish Armada failed, and they don't all fall on one person.
Mm-hmm.
People historically have blamed Medina Sidonia. That was kind of the fashionable, traditional thing to do. Some people blame Parma for his role in not being ready to go. You could really just blame Philip II. So, that's going to wrap up our main sequence here. There's a lot of things that were left out strategically. Some things that were probably left out accidentally too. So next week we'll be recording our bonus episode, and patrons will have access to that. It'll be kind of a catch-all similar to the Lusitania bonus episode. Some particular focuses, though, on what's going on in England itself during the campaign. So I want to talk about the preparation of English land forces. We'll talk about the very famous, though probably largely or entirely fabricated Tilbury speech from Elizabeth. It's a very famous speech that probably didn't happen.
Right.
So we'll talk about that, and also want to look at what would an England that fell to the invasion have looked like. What were some of the kind of what ifs here? What happens maybe if the Spanish Armada lands?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those discussions. Anytime we can do the what ifs and that kind of thing, that's always fun, just to explore different things.
We're going to Harry Turtled of it. What if?
Awesome. I've learned a lot in this series.
What if the Spanish Armada had AK-47s?
What if? Yeah, what if? A different kind of guns of the South. this series has been great though. Like I didn't know a lot about this, so like learning a lot of the details and everything. I'm gonna have to find like I'll probably read some books about this and dig even deeper. But
I got some books for you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'll have to read some of the ones that you have. It's been a really interesting thing to learn more about, though.
Yeah, and for our listeners, we'll be back. We'll be recording the bonus next week in addition to, I guess, what we'd call a normal episode back to...
Yeah, I don't know what we're going to do yet. I'm going to find one. It'll be a little more of a traditional episode, though, as a treat.
As a treat. You get one straight decker for every 5 episodes of Spanish Armada. So from me, thank you for listening to us all this way. Truly, and I say this only like partially facetiously, but like truly a childhood dream come true to sit and talk for like 6 hours about the Spanish Armada and have anyone listen to it. So yeah, if you have listened to this, that's awesome. We make this show because we enjoy making the show, but it's fun when people listen also.
Yep.
So thank you for coming with us all this way. We look forward to moving on to some new topics in the rest of season 3. So take care, everyone, and we will talk to you again next week.